Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're just giving a few minutes for folks to file in and connect. Sometimes our computers are not as speedy as we would like.
We also have a host of international participants joining from around the world.
And for our attendees, I've just reposted our event agenda there in the chat box. If you did not receive the email from me last week. We'll just give everybody about one more minute.
Could I just say everybody's remarks will be approximately 10 minutes?
Or just under, yes.
And I'm going to count on you to keep your time. If it's
I will be, yes, for sure.
Over, I'll start waving or something. But
Alrighty, it looks like we are about 5 minutes after. So, with respect to everybody's time, we'll get going. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Maritza Kremen. I'm the program manager at Global Fund for Widows. On behalf of the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations and GFW, we're so excited to have everybody here today to discuss this important issue, particularly in light of the intention of Sierra Leone and the Africa Group to table a resolution on widowhood in the third committee in just a few weeks' time. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Maritza Chan Valverde, Deputy Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the UN.
Good morning, everyone. And the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica is pleased to partner with the Global Fund for Widows in hosting today's side event, the first one of UNGA 76. The theme of today's event naturally aligns with one of Costa Rica's broader domestic and foreign policy objective, that of gender equality and socio-economic empowerment of women and girls. As an advocate for issues related to the advancement of women, I'm also personally grateful for this opportunity to address this meeting and to contribute to raising awareness of the unique circumstances of widows in the context of global policymaking. In recognizing International Widows' Days on June 23rd this year, the United Nations estimated that there are more than 250,000 million women worldwide, widows worldwide. Therefore, in order to achieve gender equality and to ultimately progress towards the attainment of the SDGs, it is essential that the full rights of widows are achieved. The number of widows worldwide have increased over the last years due to armed conflicts, violent extremism, natural disasters, migration, epidemics, and now COVID-19, which has been referred to by some as the widowmaker. According to the UN, the pandemic is leaving tens of thousands of women newly widowed and exposed to rejection and mainstreaming by their families and neighbors. Rampant hunger, fueled by lockdowns and soaring unemployment, makes life even harder for widows totally exposed and dependent to menial work or begging to survive. This is precisely why the international community must shine light on the issue of widowhood. Widows who have been marginalized and deprived of assets, who have suffered a cycle of disadvantage and poverty, who still face persistent discrimination and abuse, including sexual abuse, forced labor, and destitution, possess a first-hand knowledge of the life experience to contribute meaningfully to a plethora of issues in our collective agenda. Their contributions are fundamental to sustainable development and to sustaining peace. Widows matter. They're precious members of our communities whose value is not simply determined by the fact that they were once married to a man. Let's not forget they are survivors, that they're resilient, they're motivated, and they still have hopes and dreams. They have a name and a voice desperate to be heard. We must stand up as a sisterhood and ensure they are recognized by our governments and by the international community. Widows' rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. This morning, we'll listen to activists, academics, widows and women's organizations who are working tirelessly to defend women's rights. I applaud your efforts and I stand ready to support your cause. You have in me and in Costa Rica an ally. I thank you.
So I think, let me just say thank you on behalf of all of us to Ambassador Chan Valverde for that really wonderful introduction. I think that your final words on widows' rights as women's rights and women's rights as human rights are absolutely to the point. Widows are so often the forgotten women. They're forgotten in every dimension of public policy. They're virtually never talked about. They're really privatized in the family structure. And they're perhaps the starkest reminder that we have of the way in which marriage law and family law still cuts across and determines so much of women's lives. And I think part of the difficulty and the issues that we're going to be talking about today have to do with the fact that when you address the problem of widows, you're addressing the issue that's at the intersection of family law, property law, and economic law, or I should say family policy and economic policy. We have to, in this sense, deprivatize the problem of widowhood because we have to render unprivate, if you like, or bring forward the issue of women's rights to their independent existence. So with that, I'd really like to thank the organizers of the panel, to thank the Global Fund for Widows, and to thank Costa Rica and the Ambassador Chan Valverde for hosting this discussion, and most importantly, to express my great support for the resolution that I hope will be tabled, will be put forth very shortly. And I would like to invite the first of our speakers, who I think that we will begin with a video from, am I correct? That we're going to begin with the video from Ms. Agnieszka Fal-Dutra Santos of the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders.
We don't have sound.
Just one moment while I figure out the sound situation, please.
Rica, perhaps we can, no, let's move to the next speaker, and we can also add the link to our colleagues' message in the chat for our colleagues to hear it. We apologize for the inconvenience.
Sure, sorry. I had not realized, since nobody said anything since I changed the settings. We can go ahead and do that.
Okay. So, so Heather, are you next in the lineup?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Pleasure to introduce Heather Ibrahim-Leathers from the Global Fund for Women. Thank you.
Widows. But yes, thank
Sorry.
you. Your Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, and dear friends, good morning and good afternoon. As founder and president of the Global Fund for Widows, I wish to thank our sponsor for hosting the world's first ever UN General Assembly side event, the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations, and Her Excellency Ambassador Maritza Chan Valverde. Thank you for making history this morning. I also wish to thank the esteemed panelists and our moderator, Professor Ergas of Colombia. It is an honor to have leading voices in women's rights and gender equality joining the widowhood movement today and contributing to the discussion about mainstreaming the widowhood human rights crisis. Your voices will reverberate around the world. Widowhood remains an under-recognized human rights crisis affecting almost 300 million women around the world and some 500 million of their children. This represents roughly 13% of the world's population, and yet their plight has remained largely invisible to our global consciousness, which renders it unaddressed from a policy perspective and by extension, utterly under-resourced. Global Fund for Widows believes that there are major types of human rights violations against widows, namely disinheritance, discrimination, and harmful practices, which are not only directly linked to poverty, but are deeply interconnected with fully 12 of the Sustainable Development Goals. This graphic illustrates the complicated and tragic web of implications on the 2030 agenda by not addressing widowhood. This actually drives us away from the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, the disinheritance of a widow and the loss of her household income or assets leads to poverty, SDG 1, in turn increases her food insecurity under Goal 2, her poor health under Goal 3, poor education of her children under Goal 4, and encourages the unforgivable occurrence of child marriage under Goal 5 and vulnerable children under Goal 10. Harmful practices, for example, are condoned forms of violence against women and lead us away from SDG 3 and 5, but also link us to human trafficking and slavery, SDG 8, while discrimination leads to a lack of access to justice, away from SDG 16. Widows and their unique concerns, however, have remained notably absent in the dialogues around the 2030 agenda. This year, for example, at the high-level political forum, policymakers once more outlined their commitment to, and I quote, take a targeted measure to eradicate poverty in all of its forms and dimensions, and ensure and promote a multidimensional coordinated approach to its elimination. As a development organization focused on widows' economic inclusion, we have only seen a few member states to date undertake the development of this multi-pronged action at the domestic level. For example, in Egypt, where Global Fund for Widows operates its largest program, we have seen efforts to ensure that widows are included in social protection programs. For example, in the last 2 years, 50,000 widows were granted insurance and pension schemes. Egypt also took the unprecedented step of criminalizing acts of disinheritance and also changed its inheritance regime to accommodate the religious and cultural diversity of its population. In Kenya, where we host our second largest program, 6 laws were modified to include widow-specific protections, including the all-important bursaries for school, access to unclaimed assets, and even the establishment of a dedicated 0% loan fund, the Thamini Fund, from which widows can access funding to launch enterprises. These social protection measures are of increasing importance as we consider the proliferation of widowhood as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, COVID-19 has resulted in twice as many deaths to men versus women, creating, as mentioned by the ambassador, a tsunami of widows in its tragic wake. And the Global Fund for Widows has coined the COVID virus and pandemic as the widow maker. The HLPF outcome document stresses the prioritization of vulnerable groups affected by the pandemic, but as we have seen, the additional challenges around disinheritance and discrimination will still leave even COVID-19 widows at the margins of many states' policy and programmatic responses without the specific inclusion of this group. In light of this, Global Fund for Widows believes that it is absolutely critical that widows be included in future United Nations language in order to operationalize it. For this reason, Global Fund for Widows is working with the mission of Sierra Leone and the Africa Group to put forth a resolution that will not only mainstream widowhood as a bona fide human rights crisis, but will provide the path for permanent inclusion. Advancements, such as requiring all marriages and unions to be registered with government grants widows indisputable rights to their inheritance. Reaffirming the rights of widows to inheritance and ownership of land and valuable assets as outlined by their national laws, including widows and national action plans, allowing them eligibility and access to justice and social protections, and criminalizing all acts of disinheritance and harmful practices will be critical steps in operationalizing widowhood. We believe that a resolution and official UN language and international law protecting widows, that duty bearers will no longer be able to dismiss the issue and will further finally drive the reallocation of legal and financial mechanisms needed to protect widows, as Professor Ergas just alluded to. As the world's largest NGO on widows' economic inclusion, Global Fund for Widows has seen how critical this component is to attaining the SDGs. Our theory of change centers around a very simple tenet of the golden rule. She who has the gold makes the rules. And so Global Fund for Widows does this by building its award-winning proprietary microbank called the WSALA, the Widows Savings and Loan Association. These banks are owned and operated by the widows themselves, giving them the agency and dignity they deserve and the financial capital they need to launch and expand income-generating businesses. To date, we have established over 100 WSALAs around the world. We're launching 2 tomorrow, additional 2 tomorrow, empowering over 20,000 widows and 50,000 of their children, enabling them to sustain their families, return their children to school, save daughters from child marriage, and sons from extremist recruitment. Economically, WSALA members have become well off. increasing their savings and wealth by 500% in the first year of joining the Wasala. Yes, 500%. Enjoying reintegration into public life, gaining structure and power and voice within their communities, and even running for public office. As a programmatic intervention, the Wasala allows us to reverse the impact of human rights violations against widows and in fact move them and their nations closer to achieving the SDGs. This is not something the Global Fund for Widows can do alone. We will rely not only on other practitioners such as Landesa here today to build in this gender sensitivity, but for funders to do the same. For this, we look for member states to launch widowhood initiatives. We salute, for example, the United Kingdom, which has implemented a policy within its Foreign Aid Office that requires the inclusion of widows in its gender development programming, even taking the step to create a fund that will resource such development. These advances provide us with a useful example of how member states can ensure a more holistic and effective development programming. Moving forward, Global Fund for Widows hopes that the General Assembly will adopt a widowhood resolution next month, and that it will pave a path for discussions and programmatic interventions that target widows' needs, but that stakeholders across the United System as well will do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather. That was so impressive as well as so interesting. And I'm sure we'll have lots to discuss and more to learn from as we go on. So if everybody is agreeable, we could now apparently turn back to the video from Agnieszka Fal-Dutra Santos from the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, and then we'll move forward with the rest of our program.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. And thank you very much, Professor Ergas. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this important discussion. First of all, my apologies for not being able to join you in person or in virtual person. I really hope to be there to be able to interact and exchange with the other panelists and audience members. But in this age of back-to-back Zoom calls, scheduling can sometimes be a challenge. But still, it is a pleasure to be able to share some thoughts on the overlaps between widowhood and the place of widows, their needs and their leadership, their roles in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is the agenda that I work with in the context of my work with the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. And there is numerous intersections between the Women, Peace and Security agenda and widowhood and widows. At the conceptual or principle level, of course, widows are a key group of people to consider when thinking about women, peace and security. As I'm sure my other colleagues and fellow panelists will discuss in more detail, widows often face unique threats and challenges in the context of conflict, violence, and displacement. They often deal with unaddressed trauma and mental health impacts of losing a loved one, which are often not recognized, and they do not have access to psychosocial care and support that they need. They are often single parents and single heads of households, which places extraordinary economic, financial, and unpaid care burdens on them. Widows can also be particularly vulnerable to different types of violence. They can be targeted because of their status and their perceived defenselessness and vulnerability. They can face violence and abuse from their communities and from their in-laws, from their families, because of the cultural and social stereotypes that often surround widowhood. However, far from being helpless victims, widows have also been at the forefront of the efforts to build inclusive and sustainable peace in many countries. In fact, many women's peace movements originated from movements and protests that have been led or supported by widows and women who have lost their loved ones. From Argentina to Serbia to Chechnya, widows have been at the core of women-led work for inclusive and sustainable peace. And they've often contributed to reconciliation processes in their communities as well, calling for accountability, supporting transitional justice processes, but also calling for peace and building the culture of peace and calling to an end of interethnic tensions, of end of conflict, and for non-violent resolution of conflict and tensions. Despite these meaningful and huge contributions, widows are largely absent or not visible at the policy level in policies that surround women, peace and security. The women, peace and security resolutions in themselves do not explicitly mention widows or widowhood. They do recognize several of the challenges that are amplified for widows, like I mentioned, but they do not explicitly mention widows as a separate group. However, this does not mean that widows are not relevant to the women, peace and security agenda. In fact, the women, peace and security resolutions do provide a strong framework and a unique opportunity to integrate the specific needs of diverse women. And that, of course, should and must include widows in the needs analysis, response to conflict and peace building at the national level. So in practice, there have been some instances where this opportunity has been seized, in particular by women and widow activists, and the women, peace and security resolutions have been used by those actors as a useful tool to highlight the experiences and leadership of widows and to better integrate them into national policies and processes. And while it's still very far from being a standard practice, there are instances where widows have been recognized and included in national action plans on women, peace and security. For example, in Iraq, the National Action Plan lists female heads of households and other vulnerable groups, including widows, as a key stakeholder group to be consulted and included in the implementation of the NAP. This mention of widows, even though it comes in this broader framework and is mentioned in a single breath with other vulnerable groups, which of course, might not always be the right way, but the use of this language does provide a legal framework at the national level and an instrument for widows and widow-led organizations to demand meaningful inclusion in needs analysis, for peace-building programming, in consultations and decision-making around peace and security, around post-conflict recovery and reconciliation, and in the implementation of the National Action Plan itself. So it is really important. And it should be recognized that such inclusion almost always built on the broader advocacy of women activists and crucially widow activists in the country. For example, in Iraq, the inclusion of women in the National Action Plan built on the years of work by women's organizations such as the Iraqis Women's Network, Rafidain Women's Coalition, and local level organizations that have spread awareness about the roles and experiences of widows and have highlighted their perspectives within the Iraqi society and in their advocacy. For example, by submitting a shadow report to the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Committee, on the Iraqi women in armed conflict and post-conflict situation, and dedicating an entire section or chapter of that report to the situation of widows in Iraq in the context of conflict. Another example I wanted to mention is Ukraine, where the experiences of widows have really been brought to the fore through the localization of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Localization is a strategy that my organization, the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, has developed and has been spearheading since 2010 as an effective instrument for the implementation of women, peace and security. And as part of that localization, we convene various actors, local authorities, mayors, local councillors, traditional religious leaders, local security forces representatives, together with diverse women, young women, and representatives of the local community to jointly discuss the Women, Peace and Security resolutions and discuss their priorities within that framework. In Ukraine, as part of these convenings, there were widows, including young widows, who were part of the localization process. And because of that, the disproportionate burdens and discrimination faced by widows in the context of post-conflict or conflict-affected regions in Ukraine has come to light and has become part of the discussion. And this, together with the mapping of needs, mapping of priorities report that we developed together with our partner, Democracy Development Center, has really formed a foundation for civil society-led advocacy that our partner, Democracy Development Center, has been strongly involved in, to call for more effective inclusion of the so-called new groups that emerged due to conflict, including women veterans, including internally displaced women, and crucially, including widows and war widows in particular, to take them into consideration in the development of national policies on peace and security and in the implementation of the National Action Plan. As of yet, widows are not explicitly mentioned in Ukraine's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, but they are very much part of the process of the development and implementation of the NAP. They were consulted, they were part both of the evaluation of the first National Action Plan and of the drafting of the second NAP. And like I said, there is strong civil society movement and advocacy for stronger inclusion of the perspectives of widows in the implementation of the National Action Plan. But there is still a long way to go because the good examples are few and far between. And even in cases such as Ukraine, where there has been important progress, widows are not explicitly mentioned in the National Action Plan. Such mentions are really important because, like I said, they provide this concrete legal advocacy instrument to widows and women-led organizations, but they also counteract the invisibilization that widows have faced in the context of conflict and post-conflict recovery, that their roles, their contributions, their leadership, and their potential has faced in this context. And so far, the integration of widows and their needs and leadership has at best been tangential, and they've been mentioned as part of vulnerable groups more broadly. But this is important. I think it's important to recognize this beginning, to recognize those civil society efforts that led to those mentions and to these policy developments, and to build on them. So how can the integration of widows and their needs be strengthened in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and in the policies, both at the local, national, but also regional and global levels? I wanted to conclude with just two observations on what an effective, meaningful integration of widows and their needs and leadership could look like. And first of all, I think it's important to recognize that widows' roles and needs need to be integrated across all the pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So participation, protection, prevention of conflict, and relief and recovery. The protection pillar is often perceived as the most natural one to highlight the needs of widows, and of course it should be so. But widows' perspectives should also be reflected across the other pillars. For example, when we speak about participation, considering the specific barriers that widows might face to political participation, to participation in peace processes, and in relief and recovery, thinking about widows' needs in terms of recovery, in terms of access to mental health services, in terms of economic recovery, and how they themselves can also be included in decision-making about those issues. And secondly, recognizing the diversity of widows when we include them in national, local, regional, or global policies. Not all widows will face the same challenges and needs. Widows from particular ethnic or religious groups may face additional burdens or risks, And it is also important to recognize the special needs and the enormous peace-building potential of young widows, young women who lost their spouses as a consequence of the war. And here the intersection of the Women, Peace and Security agenda with the Youth, Peace and Security agenda is a particularly important opportunity to create spaces for meaningful participation and leadership for widows. So to conclude and sum up, there is some good practices, there are some good examples, there are many inspiring widows who are leading, who are taking part in decision making, taking part in civil society advocacy. There is a lot to build on, but there is still also a long way to go. Thank you once again for inviting me to this discussion. Sorry I could not be there in person, and I hope you'll have a fruitful exchange to identify some concrete steps towards closing the gap that we still have ahead of us. Thank you.
I was going to thank Agnieszka for this very informative and I would say also very forward-looking intervention that gives us a really one indication of a path that can be followed at least for one sector. And I think that's extremely important. Our next speaker is Stephanie Johansen from the Women's Refugee Commission. Please, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Professor Ergas, and thank you to the Global Fund for Widows and Costa Rica for hosting us today during a busy UNGA month, I would say. For those who don't know us, my name is Stephanie Johansen. I work for the Women's Refugee Commission. We're a research and advocacy organization that works to protect the rights and advance the rights of women, children, and youth. And I'm going to stay in the context that Agnieszka so well discussed, which is the humanitarian context. And I think for a lot of us, we are aware that situations of displacement make everything worse. Agnieszka already mentioned a few risks, such as gender-based violence, but there's also the breakdown of community structures, breakdown of healthcare systems, as well as negative coping mechanisms, such as child and early forced marriage. Just a few days ago, I read about Afghanistan, of course, which is very much on all of our minds, where the Taliban announced that widows under 35 have to be married to Taliban soldiers. So I think it's a good example of the extreme dangerous risks and discrimination that widows face. Another aspect that I think gets little attention, but we will probably hear later on the economic discrimination, but how national laws actually impact widows. And I think one example that comes up in displacement quite frequently are nationality laws. And a lot of people don't know this, but we still have 25 countries that do not allow women to transfer citizenship to their children, which of course opens a whole range of issues, but really disproportionate widows who are on the move quite negatively. Because if you think about it, when people are in displacement on the move, it's really tough, to even access civic documents such as birth certificates, marriage documents. It's really difficult for widows to prove paternity if they're displaced and if the country doesn't allow access and grant them these rights. So discriminatory nationality laws are a huge issue. And of course, this is an appeal to all member states listening to also look at their nationality laws and see how it impacts women and make sure to eliminate discrimination. I think Agnieszka already touched a bit on the legal frameworks and the UN frameworks. In our work at WRC, we try to always take an intersectional approach, which of course looks first and foremost at the power dynamics in displacement settings, who holds powers, and how do characteristics such as age, gender, disability, and other diversity factors, and in this case, of course, the marital status, impacts how people are included, how they face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and really include the affected populations to lead with the solutions they bring to us. And in the context of widows, we often see examples where widows are discriminated because they're widows, because they're women, and because they're refugees. So again, just to visualize some of these discriminations they face. A lot of UN frameworks do, luckily nowadays, include age, gender, and disability and diversity considerations, including the relatively new Global Compact on Refugees, where these considerations are referenced throughout. But as we all know, every document is just as good as its implementation. So one of our main recommendations is really utilize these good humanitarian policies we have and implement them in a way that puts widows' rights and experiences front and center. At WRC, we, of course, early on had a very strong focus on female-headed households, which, again, in the displacement context, where you have family separation, you don't just have widows, but you have men detained and experience all kinds of human rights violations, to really make sure that they have the support they need, including on healthcare, sexual and reproductive rights. Again, widows have diverse needs, and I think they're not put on pause when you're in displacement. So that's quite important. So just to finish off with some recommendations, which of course is that host countries and those supporting displaced populations have to be really inclusive and sensitive to the needs and situation of widows. And this includes everything. So from migration policies, reception centers, make sure that you register female-headed households individually. And the example I mentioned earlier, really eliminate laws that discriminate against women. And if we get rid of those, it really goes a long way of improving the situation of widows as well. And then secondly, really utilize the humanitarian policies we have, especially those that already take an intersectional approach. And just to stress again that sometimes widows are not necessarily explicitly mentioned, but luckily both the Refugee Convention, whose anniversary we just celebrated, as well as international humanitarian law have a really, really strong non-discrimination mandate. So really use that in a way that we can fight discrimination of widows. And then last but not least, and this is also something that came up, really partner with local organizations. And I'm so delighted to hear from the work of the global and important work the Global Fund for Widows is doing, because I think it's really about self-empowering communities, self-empowering widows who are already organizing and leading the fight, and really follow their expertise. And in this respect, I think it's really important to, again, highlight the mental health dimension as well, because we all know how tough it is to lose a very close loved ones. But now imagine if that's in displacement, where you don't know where you're going to get food the next day, where your children will have some kind of education, and just to really understand those needs. So I'll stop there, but looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Here. Okay. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think that I really appreciated in your intervention, first of all, the specific attention to widows, but also in the recommendation for inclusiveness, that to be inclusive actually requires very often specification, that you're not inclusive simply by making a generic statement about women or whatever the category is, but that you have to say something very particular about lifting the restrictions that concern widows, and possibly also developing positive policies towards them in order to compensate and to support them in particular through humanitarian crises. All right, so thank you so much for that, and I'm sure we'll come back to in discussion. Our final speaker is Beth Roberts from the Landesa Rural Development Institute, which of course is critical, land rights being critical to so much of what affects widows. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Professor Ergas, and thank you to the Global Fund for Widows, as well as to Costa Rica for hosting us during UNGA. And to my fellow panelists, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Landesa, our work has spanned 50 countries over the last 50 years. We work to secure legal rights to land from the perspective of seeking to end extreme poverty. So still today, despite urbanization, despite all of the industrialization that's happened across the globe, 3/4 of those experiencing extreme poverty still live in rural areas. And the thing that they have in common is they depend on land as their most fundamental asset. So still either partially or totally livelihoods are derived from land in wide swaths of the world. The estimate is that 2.5 billion people, so about a third of humanity, still depends on land for a living. So that's local communities as well as indigenous peoples groups, and that they are protecting and managing our forests and grasslands and farmlands and ecosystems that are crucial to humanity's survival. And women's rights issues within those local communities and indigenous groups are crucial to gender equality. So I direct our Center for Women's Land Rights, and within that look at gender equality and social inclusion issues and intersectional issues related to creating equality to access to land, but also control over land. And so to why is that crucial? The way in which land is managed is crucial for all of us, and as we face the climate emergency, but also, you know, I will be talking from a development perspective. We've heard a couple of speakers talk from a humanitarian perspective. You know, as we think about how to manage our precious resources on our one precious planet, thinking about those who live on those on lands and territories, and how we create equality for those folks is a key component of how we meet the SDGs and how we fulfill human rights obligations. So why is land so crucial to widows? So I think we can unpack that. We've heard from a number of panelists why that's important. It's important from the context or from the perspective of inheritance. It's important from the context of economic empowerment. It's important because living close to land is the reality for most people in rural areas. For widows in particular, it's important because widows, we've talked a little bit about this among fellow panelists as well. Widows experience this secondary status, and that is often unlocked, or the economic consequences of secondary status that women experience because of gender inequality is often experienced much more harshly and suddenly when women become widows. And so what I mean by that is that in the context of land, women experience a particularly acute form of secondary status. There's this sort of infamous quote in the women's land rights world that you'll often hear repeated when you begin to talk about women's land rights or advocate for women's land rights. The pushback to that often comes in the form of a question, and that question is, "My wife is my property. Why should my property own property?" It's something you'll hear over and over and over again. And I share that to say, you know, this is the social norm that we confront. This is where we're starting from, but also to note that I think that is the question that deserves an answer. That is what we need to unpack. That is how women are viewed. And that if we want to achieve gender equality, we need to confront that social norm at its roots. That we can't believe that gender equality is anything less than the view that women are essentially property, and that gender-based violence, that human trafficking, that all of these other realities that women and girls encounter are due to that root, that women are viewed as truly second class. And as less than human and as property. And in the context of land ownership and access, what that means is that women aren't just unequal, but that they are fundamentally different. And so when a woman's husband dies, she isn't just counted as someone who is grieving and someone who is vulnerable. She is counted as often part of a man's estate. And so that leads to disinheritance, that leads to her in-laws seeing her as being in the way of claiming the land that might be valuable in the context of an agricultural community. So in the context, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between formal and informal laws. There's been an enormous amount of progress. Again, my fellow panelists have talked a little bit about progress. Heather mentioned progress in Egypt and in Kenya specifically in changing laws in inheritance. Over the last couple of decades, there has been enormous strides made to establish better formal laws in legal frameworks across the world to secure equal rights to land, to secure joint titling, to secure equal inheritance rights for girls, to secure equal spousal rights upon divorce or death. But there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in formal law. And then, as Stephanie noted, a document is only as good as its implementation. And so, again, I would also urge member states present for this panel to see implementation as crucial to fulfilling human rights obligations to widows in the context of land, but also to economic benefits. All of the links that Heather mentioned to other SDGs are foundational to widows' rights and connected to ending poverty in rural areas. And then under customary systems, there's often a huge disconnect between formal law and customary systems. And so I mentioned the need to squarely confront or address or come face to face with the social norms that characterize women as property. And I don't mean to demonize those or to demonize the men that hold those views. I think what that requires is to hold respect for the traditional views and customs that are present across the world, but also to hold those up against the international frameworks that hold the standard for equality. So the standard for equality under human rights law is Article 15, equal legal personhood for women under CEDAW. So to work with the gatekeepers of culture within communities, so traditional authorities, religious figures, village elders, to say, how do we value women in accordance with traditional norms? How do we raise up women's agency? How do we have the best outcomes for women, and particularly when women experience this loss of a spouse, and to have communities come to their own solutions about what is best. And we've seen incredible change within traditional settings and within changing social norms. So to say that is possible, that bridging that gap between formal law and traditional law, working toward a harmonization between formal law and customary law, that is a massively complex and difficult process in any given country. But investing in that process and investing in that process with a gender transformative lens is needed to realize human rights for women and for widows in particular. I want to wrap up comments by talking about some specific examples of how widows' rights have been strengthened both in law and in practice over the last couple of years, both in our work and in human rights law writ large. So specific to land, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has been formulating their general comment on the rights to land. That's been in progress for several years, but is slated to come out in their next round, we believe. So maybe this fall in their next session, and does specifically call out inheritance, specifically call out the rights of widows, and has a specific gender lens to the entire comment. That is, of course, pending the final draft, and the committee has been working tirelessly on incorporating comments from Landesa, as well as numerous other organizations from across the world. So we're looking forward to seeing that final comment and seeing the rights of widows specifically incorporated in that final draft. And that will be a huge precedent in the human rights world that will establish land in the context of human rights in a seminal way. At a more national level and local level, we have been doing work in Tanzania. My incredible colleague, Dr. Monica Moja, our Tanzania director, has been working with a mobile application called Women and Land to help widows actually due to the pandemic who have lost spouses or who have had threats to their land rights due to the pandemic. So people who are just being opportunistic in the context of the pandemic, and widows who have been targeted as a result of that. This mobile application has been used to help women and widows in particular get in contact with paralegals and then to follow their legal claim through to have their land rights better protected. And this has been incredibly effective for getting widows' rights in particular protected formally, and having widows be able to access justice. And then I'll wrap up just by saying that we've been able to be successful in shifting social norms in a program that we've been engaged in India through engaging women in a potato supply chain and working with their husbands on that front. So to say that we can bring the view of women from my wife is my property to a much more equal standing, and having women and men working side by side, holding and owning land in an equal way, and moving toward that equal legal personhood under CEDAW, moving toward that standard. So thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beth. Hello? Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Beth, for your intervention. I have to say that I consider the issue of access to legal personhood, or the recognition of legal personhood, absolutely central to all of women's rights. And that I'm glad to hear you talking about it in this way as a center point, it seems to me, of the policies that you've been developing. I was also glad to hear that there is movement from my wife is my property to a more egalitarian view through processes that engage traditional, that seem to be able to speak in the context of tradition, and to be perhaps not so confrontational as is often considered to be, is so often considered to be inevitable. I wanted to open the conversation now to discussion. First of all, to discussion amongst the panelists. And I don't know if you have questions for each other. Otherwise, I have a question that I would like to ask all of you, which is, so please, do you have questions for each other? And we can certainly start there. No. Okay. So I also think that implementation is actually key. I think that implementation is so often the missing link between, and not just the missing link between human rights as ideology or as phraseology and human rights as actually lived experience of people around the world, but also that it's implementation that prevents human rights from being an exercise in ideology. And when it comes to women, and in particular, I would think when it comes to widows, who are in so many ways marginalized and really, I said earlier, the forgotten, but not just the forgotten, they're in many ways the shadow, right? The status that one can always fall into, and that then really breaks your connection to society and to the rights that you may have had because those rights were grounded in your marital relationship. I think that the problem of implementation is perhaps even more daunting than in many other contexts. Now, one of the things that we know from a lot of political science research is that the capacity to mobilize is critical to the capacity to achieve success in terms of implementation. And I was wondering how that has played out in your experience. In particular, actually, I was thinking about this in the interplay between the mobilization of widows themselves and the role that it seems to me there may have to be for conversations with and among community leadership as in order to shift norms, that there's some kind of dialogue that has to go on in that interaction so that it's not all about mobilizing one nor all about mobilizing the other. And I think that's probably quite tricky how you put it together. So I wanted to hear more about that experience. And I think it's especially critical because if we are to have, and as I hope there will be, a wide-ranging resolution on widows, I think it's crucial that it not remain simply an exercise in well-meaning statements, that it become what it's supposed to be, which is an instrument for advocacy that ensures its realization. So how is that going to actually happen?
Sure. So thank you so much, Professor, for that question. And I'm happy to begin unless Ambassador would like to start. Okay. You know, part of the problem is the fact that there is no data. So countries that have the intention of implementing laws and change don't even know where to begin because they don't even understand what population they're looking at. So for example, in Kenya, 2 years ago, they ran their first census with disaggregated data for widows so that they can understand how many widows they had. They went into the census thinking that they had 1 million widows, where our colleagues in the field were telling us, no, we have 4 million widows. And in fact, when the census returned, it proved that our colleagues in the field were actually correct, and it was 4 million widows. So multiples upon multiples of what the magnitude is. So part of the problem in implementation for all of these countries is just having the data, disaggregated data, to identify this. And that's one of the big asks that are in the resolution right now. The second thing, the problem with implementation is that, you know, and my colleagues touched on it, I think Beth touched on it, is that not only do we have the issue of secular law, but we have the issue of customary law. And she mentioned harmonizing. The two are often incongruent fundamentally. And so while secular law may provide a path for a widow to inherit, it oftentimes will have a caveat expressly saying, however, we'll defer to customary practice. Well, the customary practice, and no one will go against the chief. No one in the village will ever go against the chief or the local leader. The fact is that there was a dowry paid for that woman. There was a dowry paid for that bride, and hence she is in fact considered property. So the custom is going to prevent any other law from being implemented, period, full stop. And so we're in a doom loop. And so implementation is really challenged. I would say in terms of the mobilization of widows, we begin from a very, very difficult base, a very low base. And the reason is this: the widow becomes a widow. She is immediately forced into these harmful practices, which are designed to ostracize and silence the widow so that she's moved out of society, and there's a convenient path, a free path for their family to inherit the land and valuable assets. She is literally forced into silence. That could be violence and abuse, which we all know what happens to women when they're abused. They go into silence. And so when they're silenced and they're moved into this survival mode, they are not able to even participate in society, much less be able to mobilize their collective voice. And so it takes resources and advocates like ourselves in the field to be able to reach these widows throughout the country, organize them, and begin to mobilize them. We have mobilized 20,000 or so widows at this point. And with that collective voice, in fact, we've mobilized more, because when you think about the number of widows we've impacted, it's only a fraction of the number of widows who've put themselves on the Wasala wait list. Right now we have nearly, I think, 100,000 widows who've placed themselves on the Wasala waitlist, just waiting for our intervention. And so when you think about that demand and that need, those widows are ready to be empowered. Once they start becoming empowered, we suddenly get the attention of local community leaders. They then become very interested in this money-making machine. These women are making a lot of money. Don't you need advisors? Sure, we need advisors. Yes, please join us. We need your help. And that begins the collective mechanism of, I would say, mobilization. But again, it comes back to laws, but really the resources, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to bring that mobilization, that awareness to the local landscape in order for us to be able to move forward. It is, in fact, a paradigm shift, but as Beth said, we're starting to see those changes very, very slowly, but it really needs the resolution. It needs codification of this language in order to draw attention and mobilize resources at the global level around it.
Yes, Ambassador, yes, please. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think that one of the importance of this event, it's, for instance, I did not know that widows were not addressed in the WPS resolution. And in this annual debate of the Security Council will raise that fact. And there are many shortcomings to the WPS resolution. It recognizes gender as binary, and it ignores widows. And I think that that's something that we as a member state can put into the debate. Because if this organization speaks in silos and manages itself in silos. So what happens in third committee not necessarily is addressed in first committee that deals with international peace and security, armed conflict, and the victims or the survivors of that conflict. So if we are able to put that part of the conversation in the Security Council when we are addressing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but also in the General Assembly, whenever there's a debate, we're going to start a movement that delegation will recognize that this is one of the shortcomings of the WPS agenda that must be integrated, and thus we need to make the adjustment necessary to reflect the circumstances, particularly in a moment when we are in a pandemic and there are many millions of women affected by that pandemic and ignored by our policies at the national and international level. And that's something that that is not acceptable. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. Thank you especially for what you pre-announced that you will do. I think that's a commitment that we're delighted to be able to count on. Beth, Stephanie, Marika.
I mean, Stephanie from WRC again, one thing that really resonated when Heather was speaking is that often widows are just, once they become widows, are just really, due to the patriarchal laws that we have and policies, they're just forced into silence. And that is something that we at WRC quite often see with marginalized group, that is the structure and there's a concept behind it, which is patriarchy. But at the same time that, as a first step, creating these spaces where people feel safe to self-identify and actually talk about their widowhood, and then really make sure they feel empowered to speak out and to address these issues, because we all know that, again, marginalized groups will often experience a backlash and reprisals against speaking out for their rights. The second point I wanted to make is on quality data, which is really, really important. And I again, take note how very different the data that is in, some of the websites that might be a bit outdated. And then when you have actual organizations who work in these countries collect. And for us at WRC, one of the minimum standards we have when collecting data is segregated by age, gender, and disability, and other factors such as LGBT, marital status. That will depend on the context, and also make sure that it's safe to collect this kind of data, because we all know, again, mentioning Afghanistan as an example, that this data also shouldn't just sit there, but it actually needs to be used and inform the program and inform the policies that come out of it. Otherwise, we're putting people at risk and collecting data, but if it doesn't get used, it won't give us. So just adding those 2 points and thanking you again.
Thank you very much. Beth, would you like to add to this discussion, or to any other aspect of the discussion on widows?
Sure, I'll follow up a little bit just on the data point as well, and just would like to say that, I think just to follow up on what Stephanie was saying, as well as what Heather was saying, and to say that there is such a lack of available data. And I think that's especially, it's true for all aspects of gender equality data, although there's enormous progress being made on that front as well. But just to say that I really appreciate Heather's approach to this in terms of linking it to all of the SDGs, and just want to urge implementation of the SDGs. We have this framework, we have these indicators, they are specific to gender equality, and I think moving forward on leveraging this incredible achievement that the global community has achieved already, and moving forward in getting more granular and more intersectional can only be better. And that takes, confronting, patriarchy, taking why has intersectionality been left out? Why are there still gender binaries? Why are women left out? Why is there a lack of data on all issues related to gender equality? But that's just the point of progress at which we are. So just want to second that point on the need for additional data. I'll leave it there. I think that's just a really important one that I wanted to second from Landesa's perspective.
Yeah. I have a question actually about the data, which is, I'm wondering whether this may be a question for Heather, whether there has been an analysis, or is there a compendium of the legal status of widows generally in different societies? Because I fear a discussion that ends up being very much focused either on humanitarian crises or on developing countries, to use that term, which has its problems. But whereas the issue of widows has historically been a European issue, it's historically been a North American issue, it's an issue that, and in some ways, although perhaps less clamorously, is a question that is still very much with us in the form, for example, of the rules that govern Social Security, that govern pension rights, that govern inheritance rights in a great many countries. And so I wonder whether an institutional analysis, or an analysis of the institutions that has a very global scope, would not also help to underscore this as really a problem that is directly related to the status of women generally.
No, that's really an excellent question, and it really goes to the crux of the problem. Number one, the short answer is yes, but. So Lord Lumba, who is one of the, again, an important activist for widows, was able to commission a study, and it's titled the Lumba Report, about 10 years ago. The data in and of itself in that report was 10 years old. So it drew from DHS data, but the data is 10 years old. So we're talking about a 20-year gap at this point of what data is reflected in that Lumba report as to what the situation is now. It doesn't account for any of the armed conflict over the last 15, 20 years, none of the situations of Ebola, COVID-19, I mean, you name it. So massive, while helpful, it is a problem. The other problem is that it draws from the DHS data, but the data itself is not seeking disaggregated data on widows. And so they're not, the censuses themselves, or censi, are not actually asking the correct question. So yes, there is something as a starting point, but nothing that we can really truly rely on. Having said that, part of the problem in and of itself also is the definition of widowhood. And Global Fund for Widows, when we present on this issue, we really have to take a moment to address the definition. So our understanding in the Global North is that a widow is a woman whose husband is in fact deceased. And it seems very straightforward. The problem, of course, is how you define husband. So in the Global North, there is a marriage registration that sits in the eyes of the government, the hands of the government, and that codifies this union. However, in the developing world of Global South, this is not the case, as most marriages are customary, in which case there's no proof of the woman's marriage. And so when the husband dies, the family who has the birth certificate runs out to collect the death certificate, comes back and says to the widow, "Who are you? What are you doing here? Your daughter-in-law has been living here for 20 years. These are your grandchildren. We don't know who you are. Get out." And hence begins this vicious cycle of disinheritance. So that's the first definition of widow that we need to address. We need to address customary marriages, and that's why the resolution that Sierra Leone is putting forth addresses this issue, registering all marriages in every country. And mindful, of course, that child marriages will never be registered because they're, for the most part, illegal, and that is something that we need to address. So that's one thing. The second thing is what we call the de facto widow, the widow whose husband has disappeared. Was it a disappearance by a state actor or a non-state actor, as in oftentimes the cases of conflict? Well, in these situations, the widow doesn't know if her husband is actually alive or dead. Is ISIS going to issue a death certificate to let her know that he is sitting in a mass grave somewhere in the desert? They're not. And so she lives in this doom loop. Can she inherit? Is she able to ask for social protections? Can she, transfer her nationality? It's a doom loop. And we have to understand what the reality is for her. And the final type of widow that we recently added in our advocacy with the United States Congress is what we call the forced marriage widow. This is the girl who went to school in the morning, was abducted in the afternoon, became a forced married child sex slave in a sense. And when she returns, we celebrate her return as a returnee. But the truth is that that's not her reality. Her reality is that she is a Boko Haram widow or, bad blood widow, and she cannot reintegrate into society. And those are very specific needs of these widows that are not even asked. These are not even acknowledged. These half widows and these child widows, they're not acknowledged. And that's something that we really need to address. So it's very complicated. Having said that, we are trying to work with Professor Osana Aladu at Rutgers in order to be able to see whether or not we can find the resources to commission a correct study on this, as countries like Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and I think South Africa begin to address the issue of widowhood in their countries and really seek this disaggregated data within their national action plans and within their census. So long answer to your question, but I think it's a really, really critical one.
No, but thank you very, very much for that. I grew up in Italy where there was a category called the white widows. And the white widows were the widows created by migration, the women whose husbands had kind of disappeared into the migrant sphere, and of course had often had no information about him, couldn't document anything having to do with him, and therefore remained married in national law, but untethered from their reality. So yes, I think that this is really a critical issue, and I appreciate how complex it is to actually try to operationalize the definition in such a way that one can get some research that can then inform. But obviously there has been lots of it and you've all been using it, but research that can properly inform policymaking going forward and advocacy. Also, I don't know if you'd like to, if we could open it up to the audience for some questions. And I'm not quite sure how this can work. Marike, maybe there's a mechanism by which we could gather some questions from the audience in the few minutes we have left.
There are some questions, yes, in the Q&A box. Marika, I don't know if you'd like to ask them, or Professor?
My commands seem to have disappeared here. So if somebody could.
I'm happy to feed you some questions.
Thank you.
Hamilton asks, women widows are in most cases left behind in participation and implementation of national peace agendas. Which mechanism can be put forward to overcome that challenge?
So, yeah, Stephanie?
I'm happy to kick off that round, and it's an excellent question. I think our previous speaker by video, Agnieszka from the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, she gave some good examples, as well as one being national action plans on women, peace and security, which of course a lot of countries have to really fill the women, peace and security agenda with life. And so I think that's a really important instrument to really zoom in on the situation of widows and make sure that any peace processes, any reconciliation process really include widows and also facilitate access for them, including by providing cost of transport, childcare, and other issues that really widows face specifically. I think in the broader context of human rights, we can also look at existing mechanisms such as the Universal Periodic Review before the Human Rights Council, which is a bit of a peer review where two member states look at their human rights records. And that's another really good advocacy opening where you can approach member states who champion the rights of widows and ask, can you please ask this countries about the specific situation of widows? Because I think, again, this is something that is often overlooked and just off the global radar. So I would really recommend looking at national and international mechanisms and see where you can insert the process instead of maybe creating another process that might risk of duplicating efforts. So I hope that is helpful, but give it open to other colleagues.
Thank you very much. And can we have another question from the Q&A?
Certainly. An anonymous attendee has asked, how can civil society advocate for specific groups' rights when there's pushback to expanding and specifying vulnerable groups in legal frameworks?
Does anybody want to?
We have the same question, to be honest with you, and for member states joining and for Ambassador, I'm sure you see this every day too. I'll give you an example of the most blatant issue that we saw during the CSW 65. Global Fund for Widows helped, advising Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone submitted, 7 major changes to the document, to the agreed conclusion. The Africa group unanimously voted to include those critical language pieces items in the agreed conclusions, and then submitted it to the facilitator, and the facilitator threw it out. The Africa group again unanimously voted to bring it back in the second draft. Again, the facilitator threw it out. And then the United Kingdom added the language back into the draft, it was thrown out. The United States added that language back in, it was thrown out. And so while there's even now political will to address the issue, not addressing these specific groups really is a barrier. And that's why the resolution is so important in codifying language to address this issue. And really, we need to move away from the elimination of special groups and really create special groups in order to address their unique needs. But I defer to Ambassador also as she works with this issue daily.
Every situation in which we are including women, all women, or whatever happens to women, it's a fight. It's a fight to include women and nuclear weapons. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is more than 4,000 words, and only 111 refer to women. In the last biennial meeting of states on the program of small arms and light weapons, Costa Rica led 64 member states to protect the gender language because many countries were denying that there's a correlation between armed violence and gender. It is very difficult to include gender in treaties, resolution, or the concerns of women or particular situations, but it's not impossible. It takes a coalition, it takes a lot of pressure, but I have seen change and I have seen these concerns reflected in the final text of resolutions or even outcome documents. But it's a fight, and it's a fight that you will have to take again in the next CSW and make sure that your coalition is broader. The African group has the ability of coming together, and you have 54 member states, and you even had 2 P5 supporting this language. Now make sure that you have CARICOM, that you have CRULAC, and it becomes an overwhelming wave of support because there's strength in numbers. And when we make this issue visible and we protect language or include language, there's resistance, but that's the reason we are here. We're here to champion issues, to make change possible, and many of us are willing to put on the fight. But as I said, it is a fight, and not an easy one. But to my surprise, the pandemic has entrenched positions, and it's even harder to negotiate virtually or to encourage member states to join you in a joint statement to protect gender language. But we have done so. It's not impossible, but it makes it even more interesting because it makes you organize better, outreach with enough time, strategize with key stakeholders, and that's what the UN is all about. So don't give up. We can make sure that this language get there, and I'll be happy to rally my regional group. And I also have contacts with CARICOM that can help you, and we will make sure that this can be, you will have a broader base of support. But change is difficult, and especially when it comes to women and girls in all their spectrum and in all the problems that we face. But hey, we're ready. We're right at dawn.
On that note, I'm so glad to be able to finish on an upbeat note of encouragement, of realistic encouragement to continue bringing this and other issues regarding gender forward. And I would say also on a note of realism, that in the end, when you're in institutional politics, you have to consider issues like coalitional relationships. You have to build your strength, and you have to know the moment that you're in. And we've been in a moment of enormous backlash against all gender-related rights. partly perhaps related to COVID and partly not. And the way to move forward is to move forward. And so on that note, I think unless there are any closing remarks, Heather, Ambassador, Beth, Stephanie, I would really like to thank you all for a really important as well as illuminating conversation that I hope will have an impact on the resolution and on the deliberations of the participants in the General Assembly. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Maritza, for reaching out to me. It's a real pleasure to have been able to participate.
Thank you all. And from Global Fund for Widows, thank you, Ambassador Chan Valverde, for your support and for hosting this historic session. To Professor Ergas, thank you for joining us. You bring a very powerful voice. Beth, thank you so much. I'm so happy that we were able to collaborate with Landesa and Stephanie for your wonderful comments, and for Agnieszka, who couldn't join us today, but we're grateful to all of you for your support. And like I said, I think we'll change the world together. So I fear for those who try to stand in our way. Thank you so much.
That's great.
And have a wonderful day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Heather,
Thank you,
can you keep me informed of what's happening in your conversations with Rutgers? I would really like to know, and if there's, I mean, at the moment, I'm just so overcommitted, it's not even funny, but if there was some way to imagine a conversation in the future, I have to be serious to say that in order to be serious, I have to seriously say this has got to be in the future. But in the future, this seems to me to be an absolutely critical issue that I would like to help with in some way.
Honored. We would be honored. We've been really trying to work with, Colombia, first of all, in general, but also just, academia in order to be able to address the issue, because really thought leadership comes out of academia. And so it would be an honor. And again, we wouldn't be able to do anything unless it's resourced. And so absolutely, as we try to create that, we would love to be able to work with you. I'm actually just down the road. I'm on 99th Street. So
that's great.
Yes,
That's true. So we can have lunch together or something.
can definitely have lunch. I would love that. I would love to see if we can formalize a program also, because we have wonderful interns that your department has that, we would be able to bring on board for some really great research and publishing that we do. And we've actually had one intern already who has been really phenomenal from your department, and now Maritza is joining us. And so we would love to be able to maybe formalize some kind of an opportunity. And then, of course, if you are ever interested in having a speaker on this issue, again, I would love to just come up and offer a unique perspective on widows, in the human rights context. So we're happy to participate in many different ways, but I'll send you an email, of course.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you so much, Professor. So nice to meet you. Thank you.
You take care. Bye-bye.